jumped off to the next car. The miracle of her presence had worked its change upon him. Gordon went over to Celia and told her in a low tone that he hoped to have arrangements made for her soon, so that she could be comfortable. She must be fearfully tired with the excitement and fright and hurry. He added that he had made a great blunder in getting on this train, and now there was no chance to get off for several hours, perhaps, and probably no supper to be had. "Oh, it doesn't matter in the least," said Celia wearily. "I'm not all that hungry." She almost smiled when she said it. He knew that what she wanted was to have her mind relieved about the letters, but she readily saw that there was no opportunity now. She even seemed sorry at his troubled look, and tried to smile again through the settled sadness in her eyes. He could see she was very weary, and he felt like a great brute in care of a child, and mentally berated himself for his own thoughtlessness. Gordon started off to search for something to eat for her, and was more successful than he had dared hope. The newsboy had 2 chicken sandwiches left, and these, with the addition of a fine orange, a box of chocolates, and a glass of ice water, he presently brought to her, and was rewarded by a smile this time, almost as warm and intimate as those she had given him during their beautiful day. But he could not sit beside her, for the places were all taken, and he could not stand in the aisle and talk, for the porter was constantly running back and forth making up the berths. There seemed to be a congested state of things in the whole train, every seat being full and men standing in the aisles. He noticed now that they all wore badges of some fraternal order. It was doubtless a delegation to some great convention upon which they had intruded. They were a good-natured, noisy, happy crowd, but not anywhere among them was to be found a quiet spot where he and Celia could go on with their suddenly interrupted conversation. Presently the conductor came to him and said he had found a gentleman who would give the lady his lower berth and take her upper one. It was already made up, and the lady might take possession at once. Gordon made the exchange of tickets, and immediately escorted Celia to it. He found her most glad to go, for she was now unutterably weary, and was longing to get away from the light and noise about her. He led the way with the suitcases, hoping that in the other car there would be some spot where they could talk for a few minutes, but he was disappointed. It was even fuller than in the first car. He arranged everything for her comfort as far as possible, disposed of her hat, and fixed her suitcase so that she could open it, but even while he was doing it there were people crowding by, and no private conversation could be had. He stepped back when all was arranged, and held the curtain aside that she might sit on the edge of her berth. Then, stooping over, he whispered, "Try to trust me until morning. I'll explain it all to you then, so that you will understand how I have nothing to do with those letters. Forget it, and try to rest, will you?" His tone was wistful. He had never wanted to do anything so much in all his life as to stoop and kiss those sweet lips, and the lovely eyes that looked up at him out of the dusky shadows of the berth, filled with fear and longing. They looked more than ever like the blue, tired flowers that drooped from her gown wearily. But he held himself with a firm hand. She was not his to kiss. When she knew how he had deceived her, she would probably never give him the right to kiss her. "I will try," she murmured in answer to his question, and then added, "But where will you be? Is your berth near by?" "Not far away. That is, I had to take a place in another car, they are so crowded." "Oh," she said a little anxiously. "Are you sure you have a good, comfortable place?" "Oh, yes, I shall be all right," he answered joyously. It was so wonderful to have her care whether he was comfortable or not. The porter was making up the opposite berth, and there was no room to stand longer, so he bade her good night, she putting out her hand for a farewell. For an instant he held it close, with gentle pressure, as if to reassure her. Then he went away to the day coach, and settled down into a hard corner at the very back of the car, drawing his travelling cap over his eyes, and letting his heart beat out wild joy over that little touch of her dear hand. Wave after wave of sweetness went over him, thrilling his very soul with a joy he had never known before. And this was love! And what kind of a wretch was he, presuming to love like this a woman who was the promised bride of another man? Ah, but such a man, a villain, a brute, who had used his power over her to make her suffer tortures. Had a man like that a right to claim her? His whole being answered no. Then the memory of the look in her eyes, the turn of her head, the soft touch of her fingers as they lay for that instant in his, the inflection of her voice, would send that wave of sweetness over his senses, his heart would thrill anew, and he would forget the wretch who stood between him and this lovely girl, whom he knew now he loved as he had never dreamed a man could love. Gradually his mind steadied itself under the sweet intoxication, and he began to wonder just what he should say to her in the morning. It was a good thing he had not had further opportunity to talk with her that night, for he could not have told her everything. And now, if all went well, they would be in Washington in the morning, and he might make some excuse till after he had delivered his message. Then he would be free to tell the whole story and lay his case before her for decision. His heart throbbed with ecstasy as he thought of the possibility of her forgiving him, and yet it seemed most unlikely. Sometimes he would let his wild longings fancy for just an instant what joy it would be if she could be induced to let the marriage stand. But he told himself at the same time that that could never be. It was very likely that there was someone else in New York to whom her heart would turn if she were free from the scoundrel who had threatened her into a compulsory marriage. He would promise to help her, protect her, defend her from the man who was evidently using blackmail to get her into his power for some purpose, most likely for the sake of having control of her property. At least it would be some comfort to be able to help her out of her trouble. And yet, would she ever trust a man who had even unwittingly allowed her to be bound by the sacred tie of marriage to an utter stranger? And thus, amid hope and fear, the night whirled itself away. Forward in the sleeper, the girl lay wide awake for a long time. In the middle of the night a thought suddenly evolved itself out of the blackness of her curtained couch. She sat upright alertly and stared into the darkness, as if it were a thing that she could catch and handle and examine. The thought was born out of a dreamy vision of the crisp brown waves, almost curls if they had not been so short and thick, that covered the head of the man who had lain sleeping outside her curtains in the early morning. It came to her with sudden force that not so had been the hair of the boy George Hayne, who used to trouble her girlish days. His was thin and black and oily, collecting naturally into little isolated strings with the least warmth, and giving him the appearance of a kitten who had been out in the rain. One lock, how well she remembered that lock! One lock on the very crown of his head had always refused to lie down, no matter how much persuasion was brought to bear upon it. It had been the one point on which the self-satisfied George had been pregnable. His hair, that scalp lock that would always arise stiffly, oily from the top of his head. The hair she had looked at admiringly that morning in the dawning crimson of the rising sun had not been that way. It had curved clingingly to the shape of the fine head, as if it loved to go that way. It was beautiful and fine and burnished, with a sense of life and vigor in its every wave. Could hair change in 10 years? Could it grow brown where it had been black? Could it become glossy instead of dull and oily? Could it take on the signs of natural wave where it had been as straight as a die? Could it grow like fur where it had been so thin? The girl could not solve the problem, but the thought was most startling and brought with it many suggestive possibilities that were most disturbing. Yet gradually out of the darkness she drew a sort of comfort in her dawning enlightenment. 2 things she had to go on in her strange premises. He had said he did not write the letters, and his hair was not the same. Who then was he? Her husband now, undoubtedly, but who? And if deeds and hair could change so materially, why not spirits? At least he was not the same as she had feared and dreaded. There was so much comfort. And at last she lay down and slept. End of chapter 13.